Tonight, we're going to talk about one of the most haunting mysteries in all of human history. Cities that were not destroyed by conquest, not swallowed by earthquake, not erased by flood, but simply left, abandoned, emptied of their people as though the inhabitants one morning decided, collectively, silently, that they were done. That whatever had held them here, to these plazas and temples and sacred mountains of stone, was no longer enough reason to stay. The Maya did not fall. That is the first thing you need to understand, and perhaps the most important thing. For generations, the story told in textbooks and documentaries was one of collapse. A civilization that burned bright and then extinguished itself, leaving behind only ruins and questions. But that version of the story is too simple, too convenient, and in many ways deeply wrong. The Maya never disappeared. Their descendants, millions of them, are alive today in Mexico, in Guatemala, in Belize and Honduras and El Salvador, farming the same valleys, speaking languages that carry the breath of their ancestors, practicing traditions that wind their roots back 1,000 years and more. The civilization did not die. But the cities, the great cities, the ones that had for centuries stood as the beating hearts of a world of extraordinary complexity and beauty, those cities were indeed abandoned. And the reasons why tell us something not just about the ancient Maya, but about ourselves. Before we can understand the abandonment, we have to understand what was being abandoned. And that requires going back, much further back than most people imagine, to the very beginnings of human life in the lowlands of Mesoamerica, to the moment when small bands of people first looked out across a jungle that seemed impossible and decided to stay. The Maya world was built in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. The lowlands of what is now Guatemala, Belize, and the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico are not, at first glance, the obvious cradle of a great civilization. The soil is thin in many places, scraped over limestone bedrock that drinks water and gives little back. The rainfall comes in violent seasonal floods and then retreats, leaving months of blistering dry heat. The jungle, where it grows thick, is dense and disorienting, full of creatures that bite and sting and kill. There are no great navigable rivers here, no broad fertile plains like those that nurtured the first cities of Mesopotamia along the Tigris and Euphrates. And yet, out of this difficult, beautiful, demanding landscape, the Maya built something that still has the power to take your breath away. They began not as builders of pyramids, but as farmers. Around 4,000 years ago, perhaps earlier, communities settled into the highlands and lowlands of Mesoamerica and began the slow, patient work of coaxing food from the earth. They grew maize, that extraordinary grain that the Maya did not merely cultivate, but mythologized, believing as they did that human beings were themselves fashioned from corn, that the flesh of humanity was the flesh of the sacred crop. They grew squash and beans and chili peppers, and they learned to read the rhythms of the rain with a precision that no calendar could fully capture, only generations of lived experience. For a long time, these were modest communities, villages of thatched houses, clusters of families bound by blood and shared labor, negotiating the relationship between human need and natural abundance. But something was already taking shape beneath the surface of this simple life. The seeds of hierarchy were being planted alongside the corn. Some families accumulated more than others. Some individuals proved themselves more capable of organizing labor, of speaking to the gods, of predicting the rains, of leading the rituals that turned hunger into hope. And in that slow accumulation of authority, the earliest outlines of the Maya city began to appear. By roughly 1,000 years before the Common Era, something remarkable was happening in the Guatemalan highlands and the Pacific coastal plain. Settlements were growing larger. Structures were being built that went beyond the practical needs of shelter, platforms of earth and stone that lifted certain spaces above others, that declared, through sheer physical elevation, that some places were closer to the divine. These were the first temples, or at least the first ancestors of what temples would become. They were statements in earth and rubble, proclaiming that here, in this place, something sacred was present. And then came the sight that would change everything. El Mirador. If you have heard of the Maya but have never heard of El Mirador, it is because the jungle has kept its secret well. Hidden in the remote Petén region of northern Guatemala, reachable even today only after days of difficult travel through dense forest. El Mirador was for centuries almost completely unknown to the outside world. But what archaeologists have uncovered there, layer by patient layer, is nothing short of astonishing. El Mirador was a city, a true city, thriving and extraordinary more than 2,000 years ago. Long before the famous classic Maya cities that most people think of when they imagine ancient Mesoamerica, long before Tikal and Palenque and Chichen Itza, there was El Mirador, and it was enormous. The largest pyramid at El Mirador, a structure known as La Danta, is by some measures the largest pyramid by volume ever built by human hands anywhere on Earth. It rises more than 70 meters above the jungle floor, and its total mass exceeds even the Great Pyramid of Giza. Let that settle for a moment. 2,000 years ago, in the middle of a jungle in what is now Guatemala, human beings organized themselves to move millions of tons of stone and fill and plaster to create a monument of staggering scale, dedicated to gods whose stories we are only beginning to piece together. And they did this without metal tools, without the wheel, without draft animals, with human hands and human will and human faith. El Mirador was not alone. It was connected by wide elevated causeways, called Sacbiob in the Maya language, white roads of packed limestone that linked it to satellite cities and smaller communities across a landscape that was being actively managed, deliberately shaped, consciously organized on a scale that challenges every assumption about what early civilization looked like. The forest was not merely a backdrop for Maya life. It was a resource, a partner, a challenge, and sometimes an adversary, but always something the Maya engaged with intentionally. This was the preclassic period, the long dawn before the sun of the classic Maya rose to its full brilliance. And even then, even in those earliest centuries, the patterns that would define Maya civilization for 2,000 years were already taking shape. The deep obsession with time, the intricate relationship between political power and divine authority, the construction of stone monuments, not merely as practical structures, but as cosmic statements, as physical arguments about the nature of the universe and humanity's place within it. The extraordinary attention to the movements of the sun and moon and Venus, and the great wheeling dance of the stars. The Maya were, among other things, among the most sophisticated astronomers the ancient world produced, and this was not incidental to their civilization. It was central to it. The same impulse that drove them to track the cycles of Venus across the night sky drove them to build their temples aligned with solstices and equinoxes, to design their cities as instruments for measuring the passage of time, to develop a calendar system of breathtaking complexity that could track not just days and months and years, but vast cycles of time stretching back hundreds of millions of years and forward into a future no living person would ever see. Time was not simply something the Maya measured. It was something they inhabited, something sacred and alive, pulsing beneath the surface of every stone they laid and every date they carved. And it is here, in this relationship with time, that we find one of the first clues to the mystery we have come to explore tonight. Because the Maya knew, with a clarity that few civilizations have ever matched, that cycles turn, that what rises must fall, that the great wheel of time carries all things upward into glory and then downward into silence. They carved this knowledge into their monuments. They built it into their mythology. They encoded it in the very structure of their calendar. And perhaps, in ways both intentional and entirely beyond their control, they lived it. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The story of why the Maya abandoned their cities is a story that requires us to understand first what those cities were, what they meant, what it cost to build them and to keep them alive, and what forces, internal and external, natural and human, came together in a catastrophe so profound that it emptied some of the greatest urban centers the ancient world had ever seen. It is a story with no single villain and no simple answer. It is a story about drought and warfare, about deforestation and soil exhaustion, about the collapse of trade networks and the failure of kings, about the moment when the promises that held a complex society together were no longer kept, and the people, with extraordinary quiet dignity, simply walked away. Dim the lights. Settle in, because tonight we are going back to the jungle. And what we find there, in the silence between the stones, in the roots that have split the temples and the trees that have swallowed the plazas, is not only the story of the ancient Maya, it is a story about us. To understand why the cities were abandoned, you have to first fall in love with them. You have to walk their streets, at least in your imagination, and feel the weight of what was built there. Because the abandonment was not the leaving of something small or ordinary. It was the leaving of something magnificent. And the scale of what was left behind tells us everything about the scale of what went wrong. By the time the Classic period began, roughly in the 3rd century of the Common Era, the Maya lowlands were home to a world of extraordinary complexity. Not a single empire, not a unified kingdom ruled from one great capital, but a constellation of city-states, each with its own dynasty, its own patron gods, its own calendar of festivals and wars and royal rituals, bound together by webs of trade and marriage alliance and shared culture that stretched across hundreds of miles of jungle and mountain. Think of it less like a single nation and more like ancient Greece, a world of proud, competing, fiercely independent cities that nonetheless recognized each other as participants in a common civilization, speaking related languages, worshipping related gods, writing in the same extraordinary script, playing the same sacred ball game on courts that every city of any consequence felt compelled to build. And at the heart of each of these cities stood the king, the Ajor, the Lord. In the Maya world, the relationship between political power and divine authority was not merely symbolic, it was literal and total. The king was not simply chosen by the gods or favored by them. He was, in a very real sense understood by his people, the axis around which the cosmos turned. He was the intermediary between the human world and the divine one, the person whose rituals kept the sun rising, whose bloodletting ceremonies fed the hungry gods and ensured the rains would come, whose military victories demonstrated the favor of heaven and whose defeats could be interpreted as signs of divine abandonment. The king's body was sacred. His bloodline was the city's greatest resource. His death was a cosmic event requiring ceremonies of staggering elaboration. This is why the Maya built what they built. When you stand before the Temple of the Inscriptions at Palenque, that soaring stepped pyramid rising out of the Chiapas jungle in Mexico, you are standing before what is essentially the eternal home of a single man, the great King Pakal, who ruled Palenque for 68 years in the 7th century, and who directed that his tomb be built into the heart of the pyramid itself, accessible by a hidden staircase sealed after his burial, not rediscovered until 1952. Pakal was buried with jade mosaic covering his face, surrounded by offerings, accompanied in death by sacrificed attendants who would serve him in the underworld. The pyramid above him was built to be his permanent monument, his argument to eternity that he had mattered, that his reign had been worthy, that the gods had loved him. And the inscriptions that gave the temple its name, 3 great panels of carved hieroglyphic text covering the walls of the burial chamber's antechamber, do not merely record Pakal's deeds in the ordinary sense. They place him within a framework of time so vast it makes the mind reel. The Maya long count calendar, that extraordinary invention, tracked time in cycles that extended millions of years into the past and future. Pakal's scribes used this calendar to connect their king to mythological events that had occurred hundreds of millions of years before his birth, and to project his significance forward into a future equally remote. He was not just a man who had ruled a city. He was a node in the cosmic web of time, his life a pattern that rhymed with patterns laid down at the very creation of the world. This is the Maya mind at work. And to understand it is to understand why the cities took the form they did. Every great Maya city was, among other things, a machine for making the cosmos legible. The pyramids were not just tombs or temples in the simple sense. They were artificial mountains, recreations of the sacred landscape that the gods had created at the beginning of time, when the world was pulled up from the primordial sea and the first corn plant rose from the cracked shell of a cosmic turtle. The plazas before the temples were stages for ritual performance, spaces where the human community gathered to watch their king descend into the underworld and return, to see the gods made manifest in the bodies of costumed dancers, to participate in the great ceremonial calendar that gave shape and meaning to the year. The ball courts were not stadiums in any modern sense. The game played on them, a contest involving a heavy rubber ball that could not be touched with hands or feet, only with hips and knees and upper arms, was a reenactment of the mythological journey of the hero twins, two divine figures who in the great Maya creation epic known as the Popol Vuh descended into the underworld, defeated the lords of death through cunning and sacrifice, and returned to the surface world to become the sun and moon. To play the ball game was to participate in this story. To win or lose had implications that extended far beyond sport. In some contexts, at some times, the game ended in sacrifice. Whether of the defeated or the victorious remains a matter of scholarly debate, but the sacred stakes were never in question. Walk through the ruins of Tikal in Guatemala, the greatest of the classic Maya cities, and you begin to feel the ambition of what was built here. Tikal at its height, in the 7th and 8th centuries of the Common Era, was home to somewhere between 60,000 and perhaps 100,000 people. That is not a village or a town. That is a metropolis by any standard of the ancient world, a city comparable in scale to Rome or Alexandria or Chang'an, sustained not by the gentle plains of the Nile or the Yellow River, but by the unforgiving limestone shelf of the Petane, coaxed into productivity by farmers whose ingenuity and labor we are only beginning to fully appreciate. Because the agriculture of the classic Maya was not the simple slash and burn farming that earlier generations of archaeologists assumed. Recent research has revealed a landscape that was intensively managed, almost engineered. The Maya built raised fields in the wetlands at the margins of the jungle, constructing platforms of earth above the water level and channeling the nutrient-rich mud from the canals between them to fertilize their crops. They terraced hillsides to prevent erosion and capture rainfall. They maintained reservoirs of remarkable sophistication, plastered cisterns that could store enough water to sustain a city through months of dry season. They cultivated not just maize, but a staggering diversity of food plants, managing the forest itself as a kind of garden, encouraging useful trees and suppressing others, creating what ecologists now call an anthropogenic landscape, a forest shaped by human intention over thousands of years. And supporting all of this were the trade networks, the arteries of exchange that carried obsidian from the volcanic highlands of Guatemala to the cities of the Yucatan lowlands, that moved jade from the Motagua River Valley across hundreds of miles to adorn the necks and wrists of kings, that carried cacao, that extraordinary Maya contribution to the world's pleasure, from the lowland plantations where it grew in the shade of the forest canopy to the courts of distant rulers who drank it in frothy, spiced, ceremonial cups. Salt moved from the coastal extraction sites of the Yucatan coast. Stingray spines, used in royal bloodletting ceremonies, came from the Caribbean. Quetzal feathers, those impossibly brilliant green plumes that were among the most prized luxury goods in all of Mesoamerica, were harvested in the cloud forests of the highlands and carried down into the lowland cities, where they adorned the headdresses of kings and the offerings placed in the tombs of the great. This was a world that worked. For centuries, despite its contradictions and its cruelties, despite the constant warfare between cities and the crushing burden that the ritual demands of the elite placed on the farmers and laborers who supported everything from the bottom, this world functioned. Cities grew. Populations expanded. Monuments rose higher with each generation, each new king trying to outdo his predecessors, to build taller, to carve more, to commission more elaborate painted ceramics, and more intricate jade masks, and more densely inscribed stone monuments. The 8th century of the Common Era was in many ways the height of this world, a period of cultural flowering so extraordinary that archaeologists sometimes simply call it the classic Maya florescence, borrowing a botanical term because the blooming of those cities in those centuries feels almost like a natural phenomenon, something that had been growing toward this moment for 1,000 years. But flowers bloom and then they fall. And in the decades and centuries that followed this peak, something began to go wrong, not all at once, not everywhere at the same time. The abandonment of the great southern lowland cities was a process that unfolded across roughly 2 centuries, from around 750 to 950 of the Common Era, and it moved like a slow tide across the landscape, city after city going dark, monument after monument falling silent, the dates on the stone stelae that the Maya kings had erected to commemorate their reigns and victories and ritual performances simply stopping, as though the scribes had put down their chisels and walked away. The last dated monument at Tikal was erected in the year 869. At Palenque, the inscriptions go silent after 799. At Copan in Honduras, the great city whose sculptural tradition was perhaps the most refined and humanistic in all of Maya art, the final monument dates to 822. One by one, across the southern lowlands, the lights went out, and the jungle moved in. Within a generation or two of the last monuments, the plazas were filling with vegetation. Within a century, the roots of great trees were splitting the stairways of temples that had taken entire communities a generation to build. The cities were not destroyed. They were not burned or pillaged, at least not universally. They were simply left. And the question of why, the question that archaeologists and historians and curious people have been asking for nearly 2 centuries since these ruins were first encountered by the outside world, is one of the most complex and revelatory puzzles that the human past has ever produced. The answer, as we will discover, is not one thing. It is everything arriving at once. There is a temptation, when we look at the collapse of great civilizations, to reach for a single cause. A volcanic eruption, an invasion, a plague, something clean and decisive that we can point to and say that is where it ended. The human mind craves narrative simplicity, and the fall of something as magnificent as the classic Maya cities seems to demand an explanation equal to its drama. But the truth, as the evidence slowly and painstakingly assembled by generations of archaeologists and climate scientists and epigraphers and ecologists has revealed, is that the abandonment of the southern Maya lowlands was not caused by one catastrophe. It was caused by the collision of many, arriving in sequence and in combination, amplifying each other, exploiting the vulnerabilities that centuries of success had quietly built into the very foundations of Maya civilization. To understand those vulnerabilities, you have to understand something about the nature of success itself, because the factors that made the classic Maya cities so extraordinary, the dense populations, the intensive agriculture, the elaborate ritual calendar that demanded constant construction and constant performance, the competitive dynamics between city-states that drove ever greater investment in monuments and warfare, these were not separate from the collapse. They were its architects. The same forces that built Tikal and Palenque and Copan to their greatest heights were, in ways that would only become visible in retrospect, simultaneously constructing the conditions for their abandonment. Begin with the forest. The Maya lowlands were, at the start of human settlement, covered in one of the most biologically diverse tropical forests on Earth. This forest was not merely a backdrop or an obstacle. It was a living system of extraordinary complexity, cycling nutrients through the soil, regulating local rainfall patterns, moderating temperatures, holding the thin layer of productive earth in place against the forces of erosion. The Maya understood this, in their way. Their agriculture was initially designed to work within the forest system rather than against it, using its structures and its rhythms to their advantage. But cities need wood. They need enormous quantities of it. Every time a Maya king commissioned a new temple or palace complex, the construction required not just stone, but vast amounts of timber for scaffolding, for the lintels that spanned doorways and supported roofing structures, for the burning of limestone to produce the plaster that coated every surface of every building in brilliant white. The production of lime plaster was particularly devastating to the forest, because to cook limestone into plaster requires intense heat, and intense heat requires fuel, and fuel means trees. Estimates by researchers studying the scale of Maya construction suggest that to plaster a single medium-sized building might require burning the equivalent of several acres of forest. Multiply that by hundreds of buildings across dozens of cities, across centuries of continuous construction, and the implications for the forest begin to come into focus. At the same time, the growing population needed land. Every new mouth to feed required more milpa. The cleared agricultural plots where maize and beans and squash were grown in the traditional Maya system of rotating cultivation. Farmers would clear a section of forest, burn the vegetation to release nutrients into the soil, plant for a few seasons, and then allow the plot to rest and regrow while they moved on to clear another section. This system worked, and worked well, when population densities were low and there was always more forest to rotate into. But as cities grew toward their peak populations, the pressure on the forest became relentless. The rotation cycles shortened. Land that should have been resting was being replanted too soon, exhausting its fertility. And the forest, that great regulating system that had sustained the entire enterprise, was shrinking. We know this not from written records, because the Maya did not write about environmental degradation in their monuments, which were reserved for royal genealogies and military victories and ritual calendars. We know it from the dirt itself, from cores drilled into the sediment at the bottom of ancient lakes, which preserve a record of pollen going back thousands of years, showing the dramatic decline of forest tree species and the simultaneous rise of pollen from grasses and weeds, the botanical signature of deforested and degraded land. We know it from the charcoal preserved in those same cores, evidence of the burning that accompanied agricultural expansion. We know it from the erosion layers, the thick deposits of washed-away topsoil that accumulated in valley bottoms and lake beds as the trees that had held the hillsides in place were removed. The land was being consumed by the civilization it supported, and this consumption was not occurring in isolation. It was interacting, catastrophically, with changes in the climate that the Maya had no way to predict and no power to prevent. The Caribbean Basin and the lowlands of Mesoamerica are, in the best of times, a region of variable rainfall. The seasonal pattern, wet summers and dry winters, has always created the need for careful water management and storage. The Maya had developed sophisticated systems to manage this variability, the reservoirs and canals and raised fields that we mentioned earlier. But those systems were built to handle ordinary variability. What the evidence now clearly shows is that the 9th century, the period of the most intense and widespread city abandonments, was not a period of ordinary variability. It was a period of extraordinary drought. The evidence comes from multiple independent sources, each using different methods and different materials, each arriving at the same deeply uncomfortable conclusion. Researchers have analyzed the chemistry of stalagmites from caves in Belize, those slow-growing formations of mineral deposit that record the chemistry of the water that dripped through the limestone above them, century after century, preserving a chemical signature that reflects how much rain was falling at the surface. The results are striking. Multiple severe drought episodes punctuated the 8th and 9th centuries, with the most intense and prolonged dry periods coinciding almost precisely with the periods of maximum city abandonment. Lake cores from across the Yucatan tell the same story. The sediment layers from the 9th century show dramatic decreases in the biological productivity of the lakes, indicators of reduced rainfall and lowered water levels. In some lakes, the record suggests conditions dry enough to have reduced water bodies that have been permanent features of the landscape for millennia to seasonal pools or even dry basins for years at a time. And here is where the interaction between human action and natural climate becomes most devastating. A forest, even in drought conditions, moderates the local climate to some degree. Its canopy shades the soil, reducing evaporation. Its roots hold moisture in the earth. Its transpiration, the process by which trees pull water from the soil and release it as vapor through their leaves, actually contributes to local rainfall patterns. When you remove the forest, you remove these moderating effects. A deforested landscape exposed to drought conditions becomes dramatically hotter and drier than a forested one would under the same climate stress. The Maya, by clearing their forests, had made themselves more vulnerable to exactly the kind of prolonged drought that the climate was now delivering. But even drought and deforestation together, terrible as they were, do not fully explain what happened. Because not every city that suffered drought and environmental degradation was abandoned at the same time. The collapse was not uniform. It moved across the landscape in waves, hitting some cities earlier and harder than others, sparing some places for decades after their neighbors had gone silent. To understand the full picture, you have to add a third element, one that was entirely of human manufacture that had been building in intensity for centuries, and that in the decades of environmental stress became catastrophic. You have to talk about war. The Maya were never a peaceful civilization. There is a version of the Maya that was popular among earlier generations of scholars, a vision of gentle astronomer priests presiding over a ceremonial calendar while peasant farmers worked contentedly in the fields below, warfare being a rare and ritualized affair conducted with surgical precision for the capture of noble prisoners. That version is a fantasy, and the evidence has demolished it comprehensively. The Maya fought constantly. Their history, as it is recorded in the inscriptions on their monuments, is a history saturated with warfare, with the capture and sacrifice of enemy rulers, with the burning of rival cities, with the subordination of weaker polities to stronger ones, with the intricate and shifting alliances and enmities that defined political life across the lowlands for centuries. In the early classic period, this warfare was relatively contained. Cities fought, made alliances, fought again, but the overall system maintained a kind of dynamic equilibrium. The two great superpowers of the classic Maya world, Tikal in the central Petén and Calakmul in what is now the Mexican state of Campeche, competed for influence over the smaller cities that lay between them, each trying to build a network of allied and subordinate states that would give it strategic advantage over its rival. This competition was real and sometimes brutal, but it was also in a strange way stabilizing, because both powers had an interest in maintaining the overall system of city-states that gave their dominance meaning. But as environmental stress began to bite in the 8th century, as harvests became less reliable and reservoirs began to fail, and populations that had grown to their maximum extent began to press against the limits of what the land could support, the warfare changed in character. It became less about the capture of prestige and more about the competition for survival. Cities that had been stable allies turned on each other over access to water sources and agricultural land. The elaborate diplomatic networks that had managed competition between the great powers began to fray as the cities within those networks turned inward, desperately trying to feed their own populations. The subordinate cities that had provided tribute and labor to the great centers began to resist, calculating that the protection offered by their powerful patrons was no longer worth the cost of supporting them. And into this atmosphere of fracturing alliances and desperate competition came a crisis of legitimacy that may have been the most devastating blow of all. Remember what the Maya king was. Remember what he represented. He was the axis of the cosmos, the man whose rituals kept the world in order, whose relationship with the gods guaranteed the rains and the harvests and the safe passage of the sun across the sky each day. When the rains failed, when the harvests withered, when the reservoirs dried and the children went hungry, the king's most fundamental promise to his people was being broken. Not a political promise, a cosmic one. What does a people do when the sacred order fails them? When the man who stood between humanity and chaos, who performed the sacrifices and the rituals and the bloodletting ceremonies that were supposed to maintain the balance of the universe, when that man's magic stops working, the Maya, it seems, did what human beings have always done when their institutions fail them. They began to question. And then, slowly, city by city, generation by generation, they began to leave. The failure of the king was not a sudden event. It was a slow erosion, a gradual dimming of a light that had burned so brightly for so long that it took generations before people were willing to admit that something had fundamentally changed. To understand how devastating this crisis of legitimacy became, you have to understand how completely the Maya political and religious systems had fused, how deeply the ordinary farmer in the field believed that the ceremonies performed atop the pyramids were the very mechanism by which the world continued to function. Consider what the ceremonial year of a Maya city looked like at the height of the classic period. Every 20 days marked the end of one of the 18 named months of the solar calendar, and each of those transitions required ritual observance. The end of the year The 5 Iloman days, known as Ugeb, required particular vigilance and sacrifice to ensure the safe passage of time from one solar cycle to the next. The completion of every Khatan, the 20-year cycle of the long count, was marked by the erection of new stone monuments, elaborate multi-day ceremonies, the reaffirmation of the king's authority through public rituals of bloodletting in which the ruler pierced his own body, most commonly his tongue or ear or penis, drawing blood that was collected on strips of bark paper and burned as offerings, the rising smoke carrying his sacrifice into the presence of the gods. These were not private ceremonies performed behind palace walls. They were public performances staged in the great plazas of the city, witnessed by thousands, participated in by the entire community. The king danced before his people wearing the costumes of gods and ancestors, his body transformed by paint and feathers and jade ornaments into something more than human, something that visibly channeled divine power into the mundane world. When he cut his flesh and let his blood fall onto the burning paper, the smoke that rose was believed to open a passage between worlds. Ancestors appeared. Gods spoke. The community witnessed in the plaza and in the collective consciousness the maintenance of the cosmic order. For centuries this system worked, not just politically but experientially. The rains came mostly. The harvests came in mostly. The cycles of life continued in patterns that seemed to confirm the king's efficacy. When drought struck occasionally, when a harvest failed, the system had built-in explanations. Perhaps the sacrifices had been insufficient. Perhaps the king had made a ritual error. Perhaps the gods required a greater offering, more elaborate ceremonies, more captives sacrificed, more monuments built. The response to failure was intensification, not questioning of the underlying premise. But when the droughts of the 9th century began to arrive not as occasional interruptions, but as sustained catastrophes, when 3 years of poor rains became 5, and 5 became 10, and the reservoirs that had been designed to bridge dry seasons instead began to bridge dry decades, the intensification strategy began to fail visibly. Kings responded with more elaborate ceremonies, larger sacrifices, more ambitious building programs meant to demonstrate their continued potency. Some of the most impressive monuments at Copan and Palenque and other cities date from precisely the periods of maximum stress, as though the rulers were shouting their legitimacy into the growing silence. But the rains did not come, and each new ceremony that failed to produce results was another small piece of evidence, accumulating in the collective mind of the community that something had gone terribly wrong with the ancient contract between king and cosmos. There is a text carved on a monument at the city of Copan, one of the last major inscriptions from that once magnificent city, that gives us a window into how this crisis was experienced by the elite themselves. The monument, known as Altar Q, was commissioned in the year 776 by the King Yaks Passage Chan Yopart, who was Copan's 16th ruler in a dynastic line that stretched back nearly 400 years. On its 4 sides, Yaks Passage had his sculptors carve portraits of all 16 kings, each identified by name, arranged in a continuous procession that circles the altar. The first king, Inish Yaks Kayak Mo, the dynasty's founder, is shown handing a scepter of authority directly to Yaks Passage himself, collapsing 4 centuries of time into a single moment of divine transmission. This is a monument to legitimacy. It is a desperate assertion that the dynasty remains valid, that the connection between the current king and the sacred founding moment is unbroken, that the covenant with the gods remains in force. But we know, because we have the archaeological and epigraphic evidence, that Yaks Passage commissioned this altar during a period when Copan was already showing signs of severe environmental and political stress. The population had grown beyond what the surrounding valley could sustainably support. The nobility of Copan had proliferated into a large class of subsidiary lords, each with their own palace complexes and their own retinues, each competing for shrinking resources. The reservoirs were showing signs of contamination. The dietary evidence from human remains suggests that the population, especially the poorer elements, was becoming increasingly malnourished. And yet the king carved his legitimacy into stone and hoped, perhaps, that assertion would substitute for reality. It did not. Yaks Passage's reign ended, And after him there was one more king at Copan, whose name we know only partially, whose reign was short and whose accomplishments left almost no monumental trace. The last dated inscription at Copan comes from the year 822. After that, silence. The great city that had been for centuries one of the crown jewels of the Maya world simply stopped speaking to us. The elite quarters were abandoned. The palace complexes emptied. The plazas that had hosted the ceremonies of 16 generations of kings fell silent. And yet, and this is one of the most striking findings of recent archaeology at Copan, the city did not empty all at once. After the collapse of royal authority, after the Great Pyramids were abandoned, and the Ball Court fell into disuse, ordinary people continued to live in the valley for perhaps another century or more. They squatted in the abandoned palace complexes, cooking their meals over fires built on the polished plaster floors where kings had once received tribute. They farmed the surrounding lands, though with less productivity and on a smaller scale than before. They gradually spread out into smaller settlements, dispersed across the landscape rather than concentrated in the city core. The population did not so much disappear as decentralize, choosing many small settlements over one great city, choosing survival at reduced scale over the maintenance of the elaborate system that had made the great city possible. This pattern, repeated across the southern lowlands with local variations, tells us something crucial about the nature of the abandonment. It was not primarily an event that killed the Maya population, though certainly many died from starvation and warfare and disease during the crisis. It was an event in which people made choices, choices to leave, choices to no longer sustain the elite systems that had extracted so much from them for so long, choices to walk away from the cities and try to build a different kind of life in smaller, more sustainable, more egalitarian communities scattered across a landscape that could no longer support the demands of urban civilization. Think about what those choices required. Think about what it must have felt like to be a family living in the shadow of Tikal or Palenque or Copan. Generations of your ancestors having built and served and been buried in that place. The pyramids of your city being the physical manifestation of everything you had been taught to believe about the order of the universe. And then to decide, in the face of failing harvests and empty reservoirs and kings whose ceremonies no longer worked, to gather what you could carry, to look one last time at the temples where the smoke of ritual had risen for centuries, and to walk away into an uncertain future. That was not a small thing. That was one of the most profound acts of collective judgment in human history. And it happened in slow motion across the southern lowlands over the course of perhaps 5 or 6 generations. The pattern of departure has been studied intensively at multiple sites, and it reveals something important about the social dynamics of collapse. The elites, in most cases, left first, or died out, or were killed. The great houses of the nobility show evidence of abandonment or destruction earlier than the humbler dwellings of the ordinary population. In some cases, there is evidence of violence, of the palaces being burned or looted, of the sacred images of gods and kings being deliberately defaced, of the tombs of ancestors being broken open and their contents scattered. These are not the actions of respectful preservation. These are the actions of a population that had turned against the institutions that had ruled them, that had come to see the elite not as intermediaries with the divine, but as parasites whose demands had helped destroy everything. This is a difficult picture to reconcile with the earlier vision of Maya civilization as a harmonious theocracy, but it is what the evidence increasingly shows. In the final century of the great cities, the archaeological record documents what looks very much like social breakdown. Elite structures being burned, sacred objects being desecrated, populations refusing to maintain the systems of tribute and labor that had sustained the ceremonial centers. And then, when the situation became unsustainable, when the local environment could no longer support even a reduced population, the great migrations began. People moved. They moved to smaller communities that had not been part of the great city networks. They moved north, into the Yucatan Peninsula, where a different pattern of Maya civilization was actually flourishing during exactly the period when the southern cities were being abandoned. They moved into the highlands. They moved to the coastal regions where fishing and trade offered alternatives to the failing agricultural systems of the interior. The abandonment of the southern lowlands was not, in other words, the end of the Maya. It was a great redistribution, a movement of population away from a region and a way of life that had become unsustainable and toward regions and ways of life that offered better prospects. The center of gravity of Maya civilization shifted north. Cities like Chichen Itza and Uxmal in the northern Yucatan were entering their period of greatest florescence at exactly the moment when the southern cities were emptying. This suggests that many of the people who left the south went north, carrying with them their knowledge, their skills, their traditions, joining or contributing to a Maya world that was reorganizing itself around new centers and new political forms. But those northern cities, too, would eventually face their own crises. And to understand the full arc of the Maya story, we need to follow the people north into the flat limestone plain of the Yucatan, where the last great flowering of classic Maya civilization was still to come. The northern lowlands of the Yucatan Peninsula are a different world from the southern jungle. If you have never traveled there, you might imagine, based on the images of Maya ruins you have seen, a landscape uniformly draped in dense forest, temples emerging from a green sea of vegetation. But the north is drier, flatter, more open. The great tropical forests of the Petén thin out as you move north, giving way to a lower, scrubbier vegetation that reflects the reduced rainfall of the region. Rivers, which were scarce enough in the south, are essentially absent in the north. The entire Yucatan Peninsula is a massive slab of porous limestone, and any rain that falls simply drains through it into vast underground aquifers, invisible from the surface, except where the limestone roof has collapsed to expose the water table below. These collapses are the cenotes, those extraordinary natural wells that dot the northern Yucatan landscape, dark eyes of clear water opening into cool caves that descend into the earth. For the ancient Maya of the north, cenotes were not just water sources, they were sacred portals. They were the mouths through which one could speak to the underworld, the entrances to the watery realm of the gods of rain and death. Every major settlement in the northern lowlands was built with reference to cenotes, and the greatest of these settlements, Chichen Itza, took its very name from one of them. The name means, roughly, at the mouth of the well of the Itza, and the great cenote of Chichen Itza, into which offerings and sometimes human sacrifices were cast for centuries, remains one of the most powerful sacred places in the entire Maya world. Chichen Itza was, in the 9th and 10th and 11th centuries of the Common Era, the greatest city of the northern Yucatan. During exactly the period when the southern cities were emptying, when Tikal and Palenque and Copan were falling into silence, Chichen Itza was ascending to its peak. Its population may have reached 50,000 or more at its height. Its territory of influence stretched across much of the northern peninsula and beyond, into what is now the Gulf Coast of Mexico, and possibly deep into central Mexico as well. Its monumental architecture combined traditional Maya forms with distinct influences from the Toltec culture of central Mexico, producing a hybrid style that has fascinated and puzzled scholars for over a century. The Great Pyramid at the center of Chichen Itza, known today as El Castillo, or the Temple of Kukulkan, is one of the most famous ancient monuments in the world. 9 stepped terraces rise to a summit temple, with staircases climbing all 4 sides. The design is not merely decorative, it is astronomical. The 9 terraces, divided by the staircases into 18 segments on each side, correspond to the 18 months of the Maya solar calendar. The total number of steps on all 4 staircases combined is 364, which plus the platform at the top equals 365, the days of the solar year. And most spectacularly, at the spring and autumn equinoxes, the sun striking the northwest corner of the pyramid at a specific angle causes the shadow of the terraces to fall along the northern staircase in a series of triangular patterns that resemble the undulating body of a serpent descending from the summit toward the ground. The head of the serpent, carved in stone at the base of the staircase, receives the shadow of the body, and for a few hours on those 2 days of the year, the great feathered serpent Kukulkan appears to descend from the sky and touch the earth. Kukulkan, This name matters. In the Maya language, Kukulkan means feather and Can means serpent. Kukulkan is the feathered serpent, and in central Mexican traditions, this same deity was known as Quetzalcoatl. The overlap in the god's name and iconography between Chichen Itza and the great central Mexican city of Tula, which was rising to power in central Mexico during the same period, is one of the pieces of evidence that suggests deep connections between the northern Yucatan Maya and the peoples of central Mexico during this era. Whether these connections involved direct migration of Toltec peoples into the Maya area, or the arrival of Maya traders and diplomats in central Mexico who then returned with new religious ideas, or some more complex process of cultural exchange operating in both directions, is still debated by scholars. But what is clear is that Chichen Itza was cosmopolitan in a way that the earlier southern cities had not been. It was plugged into a wider Mesoamerican world, participating in exchanges of ideas and goods and religious practices that stretched across hundreds of miles. This cosmopolitanism was part of what made Chichen Itza's decline, when it came, so different from the collapse of the southern cities. Chichen Itza did not fail from environmental exhaustion in the way that Tikal or Copan had failed. The northern Yucatan, precisely because it had never supported the same density of population or intensity of agricultural exploitation, was less vulnerable to the kind of ecological cascade that had emptied the south. But Chichen Itza did decline, and it did so in the 12th and 13th centuries, and the reasons appear to have involved political fragmentation, competition from rival powers, and the shifting patterns of trade and alliance in the wider Mesoamerican world. The city that rose to take Chichen Itza's place as the dominant power in the northern Yucatan was Mayapan, founded around the middle of the 13th century by a confederation of noble lineages who explicitly claimed political succession from Chichen Itza. Mayapan is a fascinating site because it represents in many ways a self-conscious attempt to preserve traditional Maya civilization in a period when the great creative flowering of the classic era was already past. The city was smaller than Chichen Itza, its architecture more modest, its monuments less spectacular. But it was, for perhaps 2 centuries, the political center of the northern lowlands, governed by a council of noble houses rather than by a single divine king, an arrangement that itself suggests how much had changed since the classic period. Mayapan was surrounded by a defensive wall, a feature almost unknown at the great classic cities of the south, which reflects the more militarized and unstable political environment of the post-classic period. The lords of Mayapan had to defend themselves against rivals within their own confederation as well as against external enemies. Rebellion, warfare, and political intrigue characterized the city's history. Around the middle of the 15th century, a rebellion of the noble houses against the dominant Kokom lineage led to the sacking and abandonment of Mayapan itself. The confederation fragmented into a patchwork of small competing polities that ruled the Yucatan Peninsula on the eve of the arrival of the Spanish. This is the Maya world that the Spanish encountered when they came, and it is important to understand what they found because the popular story sometimes suggests that the Spanish conquered a decadent remnant of a lost civilization. That is misleading. The Maya polities of the 16th century were smaller and less centralized than the great classic cities had been, but they were vibrant, functioning societies. Their population was still substantial. Their religious and intellectual traditions remained sophisticated. They still built temples and performed the ancient calendar ceremonies. They still wrote in the hieroglyphic script, though books were more common than monuments by this period. They still recorded histories and prophecies and medical treatises and calendars in folded bark paper codices. They still fought wars with elaborate strategy and diplomacy. They still lived by the ancient rhythms of the Maya year. The Spanish conquest of the Maya was, contrary to what is sometimes assumed, one of the longest and most difficult conquests in the entire history of European expansion into the Americas. The Aztec Empire fell to Cortes within 2 years. The Inca Empire fell to Pizarro within a comparable period. The Maya, precisely because they were fragmented into many small polities rather than unified under a single emperor whose capture could break the system, resisted for generations. The conquest of Yucatan was not effectively completed until 1546, and even that only refers to the northern parts of the peninsula. The Itza people of the southern Piton, the descendants of some of those who had migrated south from Chichen Itza centuries earlier, maintained an independent kingdom at Tezel on Lake Piton Itza until 1697. They held out against the Spanish for 175 years after Cortes conquered the Aztecs. The last independent Maya kingdom fell almost as the 18th century was beginning, and even after that formal conquest, Maya resistance continued in forms both open and hidden. In 1847, a massive Maya uprising known as the Caste War of Yucatan very nearly succeeded in expelling the entire European-descended population from the Yucatan Peninsula, and the war continued in various forms for over 50 years. Maya communities in the highlands of Guatemala have preserved their languages, their religious traditions, and their sense of distinct identity through 5 centuries of colonization and marginalization, and continue to do so today. There are perhaps 6 million Maya people alive in the world at this moment. They speak more than 30 distinct Maya languages. They are farmers and teachers, artists and lawyers, activists and academics, weavers and priests. They know who they are and where they come from. So when we speak of the Maya having abandoned their cities, we are not speaking of the disappearance of a people. We are speaking of a specific historical event, or rather a series of events, in which certain particular cities in certain particular regions were, at certain particular moments, emptied of their populations. The people who left those cities went somewhere. Their descendants are here. The knowledge and traditions of their civilization, while transformed by centuries of upheaval and colonization, have not been lost. This distinction matters. It matters because it changes the character of the mystery we are exploring. The question is not what happened to the Maya, because the Maya are still here. The question is why, at particular moments, particular cities became places from which their inhabitants chose or were forced to depart. And when we look at the abandonment of the southern lowland cities with that clarification in mind, we can begin to see that what happened there was not simply a catastrophe imposed on a passive population. It was, at least in significant part, a response by that population to circumstances that had become intolerable. It was a rejection, in some ways, of the entire system of divine kingship and monumental urbanism that had defined classic Maya civilization for 1,000 years. The people who walked away from Tikal and Palenque and Copan were not defeated. They were choosing something else. They were choosing survival and dispersal and smaller communities and different relationships with their gods and their landscape. To understand what they were rejecting, we have to look more closely at the burdens that classic Maya civilization had placed on ordinary people, because the collapse of the southern cities was not just about drought and warfare. It was also about the accumulated weight of centuries of extraction, the crushing demands that the elite ceremonial system had imposed on the farmers whose labor sustained everything, and what happened when those demands finally became more than the system could bear. To carry a single one of the great limestone blocks that make up the Temple of Tikal to its position, a team of Maya laborers would have had to organize themselves in ways that we can only partially reconstruct from the archaeological evidence. There were no wheels. There were no draft animals. There was only human muscle, arranged with intelligence and driven by whatever combination of religious devotion, social obligation, and outright coercion could be brought to bear. The block might weigh several tons. It might have been quarried from a limestone outcrop a mile away, or 5 miles away, or 20. It had to be shaped, at least roughly, at the quarry site to reduce its weight for transport. Then it had to be moved, likely on wooden rollers laid down and picked up in sequence as the block progressed, pulled by ropes attached to teams of men whose combined effort could move stone that no individual could budge. This is just one block. A single temple might contain thousands. A city like Tikal contained hundreds of monumental structures built up over centuries, each requiring similar labor. And this is only the stone. Add to this the labor of quarrying and burning limestone for plaster. of felling and shaping the enormous timbers that supported roofing structures and served as lintels above doorways, of mixing and applying the plaster that had to be renewed regularly as the tropical climate degraded it, of maintaining the reservoirs and canals, of clearing and replanting the agricultural fields that fed the entire enterprise. The maintenance of a classic Maya city required continuous, staggering, unrelenting labor from the population that lived within and around it. Who did this labor? Not the kings, not the nobles, not the scribes who kept the calendar and the priests who conducted the ceremonies. This was the work of ordinary farmers, called away from their fields during the dry season when construction was possible, organized into work parties, moved around the landscape as royal projects required. Their labor was owed. It was tribute, extracted from them by the political and religious system that claimed to give their lives meaning and to guarantee, through the ceremonies they were helping to make possible, the continuation of the world. There was ideology in this exchange. The farmers likely believed, or at least were told to believe, and probably a mixture of both, that their labor was itself a form of religious offering, that by contributing to the construction of the temples, they were participating in the cosmic work that kept the sun rising and the rains falling. This is how such systems have always worked across human history. The people whose labor is extracted from them are given, in exchange, participation in something meaningful, membership in a cosmic drama, the assurance that their sweat matters in ways that go beyond their own personal existence. It is not necessarily a cynical exchange. It can be, at its best, a genuine and mutually sustaining arrangement in which everyone benefits, materially and spiritually, from their assigned roles. But it can also, over time, become something else. It can become extraction that has lost touch with its justifications. It can become a burden that grows steadily heavier as the elite class expands and demands more, as monuments must be built ever larger to demonstrate the potency of ever less potent kings, as the number of nobles who must be supported by the labor of farmers proliferates through the branching of dynastic lineages into subsidiary houses, each with their own claims on tribute and service. The archaeological record at cities like Copan documents exactly this pattern in the late classic period. The nobility grew and grew. Palace complexes multiplied across the landscape around the city center as junior branches of the royal family established their own courts. Each of these secondary courts had its own retinue, its own demands for luxury goods, its own claims on the labor and produce of the farming population. The pyramid of extraction became steeper and steeper. The farmers at the bottom of that pyramid were being pressed harder and harder while receiving, in return, less and less. And here we come to something crucial about the collapse of the southern cities. When environmental stress began to bite in the 9th century, when the droughts came and the harvests failed, the elite response was not to reduce their demands. It was to increase them. The evidence at multiple sites shows that in the final decades of urban occupation, monumental construction actually accelerated in some cases, as though the rulers believed that more offerings and grander temples could reverse the failing rains. From the perspective of the farmers being called away from their own hungry families to haul stone for yet another royal monument, this must have looked less like desperate cosmic maintenance and more like willful blindness, or worse. There is a concept that anthropologists sometimes use called the moral economy. It refers to the implicit understanding that exists in traditional societies between those who rule and those who are ruled, an understanding that the rulers have obligations to protect and provide for the ruled in times of hardship, in exchange for the loyalty and labor that the ruled provide in ordinary times. When rulers violate the moral economy, when they extract without giving back, when they demand more from a population that is already suffering, the traditional systems of authority can break down with astonishing speed. What had been legitimate becomes illegitimate. What had been tolerated becomes intolerable. And people who had for generations accepted their subordinate positions begin, sometimes suddenly and sometimes gradually, to withdraw their consent. The abandonment of the southern lowland cities looks, in many respects, like exactly this kind of withdrawal of consent. The farmers stopped bringing tribute. They stopped participating in the labor drafts. They stopped attending the ceremonies. They melted away into the countryside, into smaller settlements, into new communities that they built themselves without the burden of supporting an elaborate royal court. The elite, deprived of the labor and tribute that had sustained them, could not maintain the cities, and the cities fell silent. This is a simplified picture, of course, because the actual process involved drought and warfare and disease and countless other pressures interacting in complex ways across different regions and different generations. But the underlying pattern of ordinary people making choices to leave a system that had become intolerable is, I think, the deepest truth of the Maya collapse. It was not a natural disaster imposed on passive victims. It was a decision, distributed across countless individuals and families and communities, that the old ways were no longer worth the cost. And there is evidence to support this interpretation in what those who left did afterward. When we look at the smaller, dispersed settlements that emerged in the southern lowlands after the collapse of the great cities, and at the northern and coastal areas where many of the emigrants seem to have gone, what we find is telling. The elaborate systems of monumental construction did not reappear. The scale of temple building was dramatically reduced. The obsessive record-keeping of dynastic history on carved stone monuments essentially ceased in the southern lowlands. The old system, in short, was not simply relocated. It was, at least in significant part, abandoned as a form of social organization. What emerged in its place was smaller, less hierarchical, less demanding of ordinary people. It was a different kind of Maya civilization, one that had learned certain hard lessons from what had come before. There is something both tragic and hopeful in this. Tragic because the flowering of classic Maya civilization, with its extraordinary art and architecture and intellectual achievement, was a thing of genuine and irreplaceable beauty. To lose it, or rather to see it deliberately abandoned by the people who had been forced to sustain it, is to see something precious pass out of the world. But hopeful, perhaps, because the abandonment was also a kind of collective wisdom. The Maya farmers and their families recognized, in ways that their rulers could not or would not, that a system that could not sustain itself and could not sustain them was a system that had to end. And they ended it, not through violent revolution in most cases, but through the quiet accumulation of individual decisions to no longer participate. Consider what this required of them. Consider the courage of leaving. A Maya family in the year 850, living in the shadow of Tikal, would have known nothing but that city and its way of life. The pyramids had been there for as long as anyone remembered. The ceremonies had been performed in an unbroken sequence for centuries. The king, whoever the current king was, sat on a throne that traced its legitimacy back through countless generations to the very origins of the world in Maya mythology. To leave this, to gather one's belongings and walk away from everything that had defined one's identity and one's place in the cosmos, required not just physical courage, but a profound reorientation of consciousness. It required accepting that the old world was over, that whatever came next would have to be built from scratch, that the mountains of stone one's ancestors had labored to raise up would be left behind for the jungle to reclaim. And yet, generation after generation, in city after city, this is what happened. Families made the choice. Communities made the choice. They walked away from the sacred centers of a civilization that had defined their identity for 1,000 years, and they built new lives in new places. The dispersal was gradual and largely peaceful, at least compared to what such a collapse might have been. There is no evidence of widespread massacre, of desperate final battles, of populations exterminated by conquest or disease on the scale that would come later with European contact. What the evidence shows is people making choices, over decades and generations, to redistribute themselves across a changed landscape in a new configuration. The jungle came in behind them. This is one of the most striking aspects of the abandonment. The tropical forest of the Petane, freed from the intensive human management that had shaped it for over 1,000 years, began to reclaim the sites of the cities. Within a few decades, saplings were growing in the plazas. Within a century, mature trees were established on the sides of the pyramids, their roots probing into the joints between stones, their growth beginning the slow work of taking the monuments apart. Within a few centuries, the great cities were invisible from more than a few hundred yards away, hidden beneath the canopy of a forest that had returned with astonishing speed to fill the space where human civilization had once dominated. This is not the ordinary pattern of ancient ruins. When Rome fell in Europe, its buildings continued to be visible and used, some of them still standing today as active parts of the modern city. When the ancient cities of the Middle East were abandoned, they remained recognizable as ruins in a landscape that was often too arid to fully hide them. But the Maya cities disappeared. They vanished into the green sea of the Petén so completely that when Spanish colonists in the 16th and 17th centuries occasionally stumbled across their remains during expeditions into the interior, they did not know what they had found. Some assumed the ruins must have been built by lost tribes of Israel, or by Egyptians who had somehow crossed the Atlantic, or by any number of other imagined ancient peoples. That the ancestors of the Maya people they had conquered could have built these things was a possibility that Spanish colonial ideology could not easily accommodate. The rediscovery of the Maya as the builders of these ruins would require centuries of scholarly work and would come in earnest only in the 19th and 20th centuries. But long before then, before Europeans had any inkling of what the jungle was hiding, the Maya themselves had never forgotten. They remembered the old cities. They preserved knowledge of the ancient stories in their oral traditions and in their surviving books. There is a book that survives, one of only 4 from the vast library of writings that the ancient Maya once possessed. It is called the Dresden Codex because it now resides in the State Library of Dresden, Germany, where it ended up through a series of accidents of history that carried it from the hands of some 16th century Maya scribe or lord across the ocean to Europe. It is a folded strip of bark paper, coated in white plaster and painted with hieroglyphic text and images in black and red and other colors, extending some 3.5 meters in length when unfolded. It contains astronomical tables, ritual calendars, prophecies, and depictions of gods and ceremonies. It is the fullest single window we have into the intellectual world of the ancient Maya, and it survived by pure chance, one of a handful of books that escaped the systematic destruction that Spanish missionaries carried out in the 16th century. The Bishop of Yucatan, a Franciscan named Diego de Landa, ordered in 1562 the burning of every Maya book his subordinates could find. He believed the books to be, in his own words, works of the devil, filled with superstition and lies. Thousands of codices were gathered up from Maya communities across the northern Yucatan and consigned to the flames. Landa recorded that the Maya themselves wept and cried out with genuine grief as their books burned, understanding what was being lost in ways that Landa himself did not. He wrote about this witnessing with some puzzlement, unable to fully grasp why the destruction of what he considered rubbish was causing such distress. It is perhaps the greatest crime against human knowledge in the history of the Americas. We have no way to know what was in those books. We can only look at the 4 that survived, the Dresden Codex and 3 others held in Paris, Madrid, and Mexico, and try to imagine what a full library of such works might have contained. Histories that would have told us the names and deeds of kings whose stone monuments have been lost or eroded beyond recognition. Astronomical observations extending back over centuries, perhaps millennia, medical treatises drawing on generations of experimentation with the pharmacopoeia of the tropical forest, poetry, religious meditations, prophecies, calendrical calculations that our best modern efforts have only partially reconstructed. All of it, or nearly all of it, was burned. And yet Landa himself, through one of the strangest ironies of history, would end up being the source of one of the most important keys to the eventual decipherment of the Maya script. Later in his life, apparently attempting to defend himself against accusations from other Spanish authorities that his methods of forced conversion had been too brutal, Landa wrote an extended account of Yucatecan Maya culture in which he described, among many other things, what he claimed was the Maya alphabet. He had apparently sat down with a Maya informant and asked the man to write out the letters of the Spanish alphabet in Maya script. The informant, either misunderstanding the question or being unable to explain the real nature of the writing system, provided a set of glyphs that Lander recorded as the Maya equivalents of Spanish letters. For centuries after Lander's manuscript was rediscovered in the 19th century, scholars puzzled over this so-called alphabet. It did not seem to work. Attempts to read Maya inscriptions using Lander's glyptoletter correspondences produced nonsense. Some scholars concluded that the entire manuscript was a fabrication or a misunderstanding. But in the 20th century, particularly in the work of the Russian linguist Yuri Norizov in the 1950s, a new understanding emerged. Lander's alphabet was not an alphabet in the European sense. It was, at least in part, a syllabary. The glyphs that Lander's informant had provided were not equivalents of individual letters, but of the sounds of the Spanish letter names, which typically consisted of a consonant plus a vowel. Read this way, as syllables rather than as letters, Lander's list suddenly became useful, providing a foothold from which the entire system of Maya writing could eventually be reconstructed. The decipherment of Maya hieroglyphs is one of the great intellectual detective stories of the 20th century. It required the work of dozens of scholars across many decades, drawing on insights from linguistics, archaeology, ethnography, art history, and cryptography. It was fiercely resisted by some prominent scholars who had committed themselves to the view that the Maya script was essentially calendrical and astronomical rather than fully linguistic, and who saw attempts to read it phonetically as misguided. But by the last decades of the 20th century, the phonetic reading of the script had triumphed decisively, and Maya inscriptions that had for a century been treated as impenetrable mysteries could suddenly be read. What the newly readable inscriptions revealed was a Maya history far richer and more human than the earlier generations of scholars had imagined. The stone monuments were not, as had been thought, primarily ritual and astronomical texts. They were history. They were political propaganda. They were dynastic chronicles, records of wars and marriages and successions, and rebellions and captives taken and rivals defeated. The kings whose names had been unreadable for 1,000 years suddenly had voices again. Their deeds, their claims, their assertions of legitimacy could once again be read in their own words as they had inscribed them. And within these inscriptions, when scholars looked closely at the final decades of the great southern cities, they found something that confirmed and complicated what the archaeological evidence had been suggesting about the collapse. The last kings did not, in general, describe themselves as facing catastrophe. Their monuments continued to boast of victories, of ritual performances, of the maintenance of the sacred order. There is a strange dissonance between what the inscriptions say and what we know from other evidence was actually happening. It is as though the kings, right up until the moment the last monuments were carved, continued to inhabit a ceremonial world in which their legitimacy remained intact, even as the practical foundations of that world were crumbling around them. There is a monument at the site of Cebal, in what is now Guatemala, that dates from the year 889. It is one of the very last dated monuments from the southern lowlands, erected during a period when most of the surrounding cities had already fallen silent. It depicts a ruler whose name and dynasty are not entirely clear, and it is stylistically unusual, incorporating elements that suggest influences from outside the traditional Maya world. Some scholars have interpreted this as evidence of foreign rulers, perhaps from the Gulf Coast region, moving into the southern lowlands as the old dynasties failed. Others read it as a local ruler adopting new symbols in an attempt to legitimize his rule under changed circumstances. Whatever the correct interpretation, the monument at Cebal represents something like a last flickering of the old system, a final assertion of divine kingship in a landscape that was rapidly emptying of its old certainties. After Cebal, silence. The tradition of erecting dated stone monuments, which had been the central medium of political communication in the southern lowlands for over 500 years, essentially came to an end. In the post-classic period that followed, in the northern Yucatan and elsewhere, political communication shifted to other forms, primarily to the folded books like the Dresden Codex, which were more portable and more suited to a world in which political authority was less centralized and more contested. This shift in medium is itself telling. It reflects a fundamental change in the nature of Maya political culture, away from the fixed, place-based monumental authority of the classic kings, and towards something more mobile, more decentralized, more responsive to the changing circumstances of a fragmented world. But even in this changed world, the essential elements of Maya intellectual culture continued. The calendar continued to be maintained and used with the same extraordinary precision that had characterized it for centuries. The astronomical observations continued. The religious traditions continued, adapted and reshaped, but recognizably continuous with what had come before. The knowledge of writing continued, though increasingly restricted to smaller elite circles, as the post-classic political structures did not sustain the same broad scribal class that the great classic courts had supported. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, Maya scribes were still writing books in the ancient script, and Maya priests were still performing ceremonies whose forms and meanings connected directly back to the traditions of the classic period. This continuity is what makes the story of the abandonment so complex, because on one hand the great cities of the South were indeed abandoned, their populations dispersed, their monuments fell silent. The specific political and ceremonial systems they had embodied did not survive as functioning institutions. But on the other hand, Maya civilization as a whole continued. It transformed itself, it relocated, it adapted to changed circumstances. It maintained essential elements of its identity through processes of dispersal and reconstitution that were themselves acts of remarkable cultural creativity. The Maya who left Tikal and Palenque did not stop being Maya. They became different kinds of Maya, inhabiting different kinds of communities, but the thread of cultural continuity was not broken. And here we come to one of the deepest and most instructive aspects of the Maya story. The abandonment of the southern cities was, in some ways, the successful adaptation of a civilization to circumstances that its previous form could not accommodate. The old system had grown too large, too demanding, too rigid. It could not sustain itself against the combined pressures of environmental degradation, climate change, political fragmentation, and social discontent. Rather than being destroyed in a single catastrophic collapse, the civilization dissolved itself, redistributed its people and its knowledge across the landscape, and reconstituted itself in new forms that were better suited to changed conditions. This is not the same as saying the collapse was a good thing. Terrible suffering must have accompanied it. Many people surely died of hunger and warfare and disease. Many precious things were lost. But the Maya, as a people and as a civilization, did not die. They chose new ways to live, and those ways of living carried them forward through centuries of subsequent challenges, including the catastrophe of European contact, into the present day. There is a lesson in this, and it is not the lesson that popular treatments of the Maya collapse often draw. The popular version tends to present the Maya as a warning, an example of a civilization that grew too complex, exhausted its environment, and destroyed itself. This is true as far as it goes, but it misses something important. The Maya civilization did not destroy itself. Certain forms of Maya civilization proved unsustainable and were abandoned. Other forms continued. The people carried on, adapted, changed, remembered. The story is not one of civilizational death, but of civilizational transformation under conditions of extreme stress, and of the extraordinary resilience of a people who found ways to survive and to remain themselves, even as the specific institutions they had built collapsed around them. To understand what the Maya remembered, what they carried with them out of the abandoned cities and into the new communities they built, we need to look more closely at the intellectual and spiritual traditions that survived the collapse. The astronomy, the calendar, the mythology, the relationship with time itself. Time. For the Maya, everything came back to time. And to understand what the Maya carried out of their abandoned cities, to understand what survived when so much else was lost, you have to understand the extraordinary place that time held in the Maya mind. Because the Maya did not merely measure time, as we do. They lived within it in a way that requires a fundamental reorientation of thinking to even begin to grasp. The Maya calendar system, as it existed in its full elaborated form during the Classic period, was actually not one calendar, but several, interlocking and running simultaneously, each measuring different cycles and different meanings. The most familiar of these to modern readers is the long count, that great cosmic accumulation that tracked the total number of days elapsed since a mythological zero point that the Maya placed at what corresponds in our calendar to August of the year 3114 before the Common Era. Every date carved on a Maya monument in the Classic period was expressed in the long count, giving each event a unique position in a temporal framework of extraordinary precision. When we read that a certain king acceded to the throne on the day 9/13/3718 in the long count, we know, thanks to the labor of decipherers, that this corresponds to a specific day in our own calendar with only a small margin of uncertainty, and we can locate that event within a temporal framework that the ancient scribes themselves would have recognized. But the long count was only one of the calendars in use. Running alongside it was the Tzolk'in, a sacred ritual calendar of 260 days, formed by the intersection of 13 numbers and 20 named days, cycling through all combinations before returning to any given starting point. The origins of the 260-day count are debated. Some scholars believe it corresponds to the human gestation period. Others connect it to the interval between zenith passages of the sun at certain latitudes in Mesoamerica. Whatever its origin, the Tzolk'in was, and remains, the beating heart of Maya ritual life. Each day carried its own qualities, its own patron deity, its own auspicious or inauspicious character. To live within the Tzolk'in was to move through a continuously changing landscape of sacred qualities, in which each day required attention to its particular nature. Alongside the Tzolk'in ran the Harb, the 365-day solar calendar, divided into 18 months of 20 days each, plus the 5 ominous days of Uyeb at year's end. The Tzolk'in and the Harb combined to form the calendar round, a period of about 52 years in which no combination of Tzolk'in day and Harb date would repeat. The completion of a calendar round was, for the Maya as for other Mesoamerican peoples, an event of enormous significance, marking the closing of one great cycle of human life and the opening of another. A person who lived past 52 years was living into their second calendar round, a rare and sacred achievement. And beyond these calendars there were others still. The cycle of Venus, tracked with astonishing precision, its 584-day synodic period known to the Maya astronomers with an error of less than a day per 100 years, which is a level of accuracy that European astronomy did not achieve until the modern era. The cycle of the moon, integrated into the long count calculations with tables that allowed the prediction of eclipses. The much longer cycles that Maya astronomers apparently tracked, or at least conceived of, running into hundreds of thousands and even millions of years, integrating the immediate calendar of human life into cosmic frameworks of almost unimaginable scope. Why did the Maya invest so much intellectual effort in the tracking of time? The obvious answer, that they needed calendars for agricultural and political purposes, is true but insufficient. Every civilization needs some form of calendar. Not every civilization develops calendars of the complexity and precision that the Maya achieved. There was something more at work here, something that reflected a genuinely distinctive Maya intuition about the nature of reality itself. For the Maya, time was not the empty container in which events happened, as it tends to be in modern Western thinking. Time was itself a substance, a kind of active force in the world. Each day was alive, had a personality, carried burdens and blessings. The gods were not separate from time, but were themselves embodiments of temporal cycles. The passage of time through cycles great and small was not a neutral progression, but a cosmic drama in which forces of order and chaos, creation and destruction, were continuously working themselves out. This is why the calendars had to be tracked with such precision. Not merely to know when to plant crops or when to hold ceremonies, though those practical purposes mattered, but because the calendars were themselves a form of participation in the cosmic order. To keep the calendar accurately was to help maintain the cycles it measured. To fail to keep it, or to keep it inaccurately was to fail in one's cosmic responsibility. The scribes and priests who tended the calendars were not merely record keepers. They were, in their own understanding, participants in the maintenance of the universe. And this is why the collapse of the great cities did not extinguish the calendar tradition. The calendars survived because they were understood to be too important to lose. They were carried out of the abandoned cities in the memories and the books of those who left. They were transmitted through the generations of the post-classic period. They survived the Spanish conquest, though sometimes in fragmentary forms, and they continue to be used today in some traditional Maya communities. The daykeepers of highland Guatemala, the Aj still perform ceremonies according to the Tzolk'in calendar, still consult the qualities of days for advice on important decisions, still maintain a tradition of temporal knowledge that stretches back in unbroken continuity to before the classic Maya cities were built. Think about what that means. The specific dynasties of the classic Maya are gone. The particular kings whose names were carved on the monuments have been silent for over 1,000 years. The great cities they ruled have been reclaimed by the forest. But the calendar they used, the framework of time within which they understood their lives to unfold, is still being maintained by their descendants, 12 centuries after the last monument was carved at Sebel. This is what continuity looks like across catastrophic institutional collapse. The kings failed and their cities were abandoned. The calendar endured. This continuity extends beyond the calendar to other domains of Maya knowledge and practice. The traditional Maya farming techniques, the milpa system of maize and beans and squash grown together in rotation, has survived and continues to be practiced by traditional communities today, adapted and modified, but recognizably continuous with the practices of 2,000 years ago. Traditional Maya medical knowledge, drawing on the pharmacopoeia of the tropical forest, has persisted in the practices of curanderos and other healers who continue to use medicinal plants that appear in the pre-Columbian codices. Traditional Maya weaving preserves patterns and techniques whose antiquity can be documented back to the classic period through their appearance on painted ceramics and carved figures. And the mythology. This is perhaps the most striking survival of all. The great Maya creation epic that has survived, though only in the version of the Quiche Maya of highland Guatemala, is called the Popol Vuh, the Book of Counsel. It was written down in the 16th century by Maya scribes who had learned the Roman alphabet from Spanish missionaries, preserving in that alphabet the oral traditions that they had received from their ancestors. But when scholars have compared the stories in the Popol Vuh to the images and iconography preserved on painted ceramics from the classic period, more than 1,000 years earlier, they have found extraordinary correspondences. The hero twins, Hunahpu and Xbalanque, who in the Popol Vuh descend into the underworld and defeat the Lords of Death, appear on classic period ceramics, performing exactly the deeds that the Popol Vuh describes. The story of the creation of humanity from maize dough, after failed earlier attempts to make people from mud and from wood, corresponds to imagery of the maize god that recurs throughout classic Maya art. The stories that were being told and retold around highland Guatemalan hearths in the 16th century were, in essential outline, the same stories that had been painted on royal drinking vessels at Tikal 1,000 years earlier. Consider what this means for our understanding of the collapse. The great cities fell. The dynasties were extinguished. The monumental system of public art and inscription came to an end. But the underlying stories, the mythological framework within which the Maya understood the nature of reality and their place within it, survived essentially intact. The people who walked away from the cities carried the stories with them. They told the stories to their children. Their children told them to their children. 12 centuries and one European conquest later, the stories were still being told, still meaningful, still recognizably continuous with what had been there before. This is what a civilization is at its deepest level, not the buildings, not the political institutions, not even the specific technologies or economic systems. Those things can change or fail or be abandoned, and the civilization can continue if the deeper structures of meaning, the stories and the calendars and the ways of understanding the world remain intact and continue to be transmitted. What the Maya lost when they left the cities was terrible and real. What they preserved was, perhaps, more important still. They preserved themselves as Maya. They preserved the frameworks within which future Maya generations could continue to be Maya, could continue to make sense of their lives in ways that connected them to their ancestors. There is a term that Mayanists sometimes use for this deep continuity. They speak of the Maya as inhabiting a long conversation that extends across millennia, in which each generation participates in an ongoing dialogue with those who have come before and those who will come after. The catastrophic events of the past, the collapse of the southern cities, the arrival of the Spanish, the centuries of colonial oppression, the more recent violence of the 20th century civil wars in Guatemala and elsewhere, all of these are moments in that long conversation, moments of interruption and pain and loss, but not the ending of the conversation itself. The conversation continues, carried by each new generation as it comes into the world speaking Maya languages, learning Maya stories, participating in Maya ceremonies, understanding itself as part of a stream of life that flows from a source deep in the past into a future that is still being shaped. To visit the highlands of Guatemala today, to walk into the market at Chichicastenango on a Sunday morning, to see the daykeepers performing ceremonies at the old church that stands on the foundation of an earlier Maya sacred site, to smell the incense and hear the prayers, and see the flowers laid out on the church steps in patterns whose meaning connects back to the calendar systems of the classic Maya cities, is to encounter this continuity as a living presence. It is not a museum. It is not a preserved fossil of some vanished way of life. It is a living civilization, changed by centuries of change, but recognizably itself, still doing what Maya civilization has always done, still holding the calendar, still telling the stories, still finding meaning in the sacred landscape of mountains and caves and cornfields that has been the Maya home for 4,000 years. When we return to the question that has been guiding this journey, why the Maya abandoned their cities, we can now see that the question itself contains a hidden assumption that we should examine carefully. The word abandoned implies a certain kind of failure, a walking away from something that ought to have been kept. But what if we reframed the question? What if we asked instead why the Maya, at a certain point in their history, chose to release the specific form of civilization that the great southern cities represented, and to reconstitute themselves in different forms better suited to the world they actually inhabited? Then the story becomes different. It becomes not primarily a story of failure, but a story of adaptation, of the kind of profound cultural adjustment that few civilizations in human history have successfully navigated. Consider how rare this is. When civilizations of comparable scale and complexity have collapsed elsewhere in the world, the results have often been far more traumatic in their long-term consequences. The fall of Rome in the Western Mediterranean was followed by centuries of population decline, technological regression, and cultural loss, so severe that Europeans of the medieval period were sometimes literally unable to reproduce the achievements of their ancestors. When the Indus Valley civilization collapsed in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, the resulting cultural disruption was so complete that we still cannot read the writing of that civilization or fully reconstruct its history. When Bronze Age civilization collapsed across the eastern Mediterranean around the 12th century, before the Common Era, the consequences included the disappearance of literacy in several regions for centuries. The Maya, by contrast, did not lose their literacy in the collapse of the southern cities. They did not lose their calendar. They did not lose their agricultural knowledge, or their religious traditions, or their mythology, or their sense of continuous identity with those who had come before. They lost the specific institutional forms of classic period civilization, the divine kingship, the monumental urbanism, the systems of tribute extraction that had supported the elite class. But they carried the deeper structures of their civilization forward into new forms. This is a remarkable achievement, and it deserves to be recognized as such rather than being framed simply as failure. There is a reason, I think, that the Maya were able to navigate their crisis in this way, and it connects back to the point we made earlier about the fundamentally decentralized character of Maya civilization. Because the Maya were never unified under a single empire, because their civilization was constituted of many independent city-states linked by shared culture rather than by shared political authority, the failure of any particular political system did not doom the civilization as a whole. When Tikal failed, the Maya of the Yucatan continued. When Chichen Itza declined, Mayapan rose. When Mayapan fell, the smaller successor polities of the late post-classic period took their place. There was always somewhere else for Maya civilization to continue, always some regional variation that could pick up the threads and carry them forward. This decentralization, which had been a source of political weakness in some ways, was a source of civilizational resilience in others. There is a lesson here for our own time, though I want to be careful about how we draw it. The temptation, when looking at ancient civilizational collapses, is to project them forward as warnings about our own situation. Some of these projections are useful. It is genuinely true that the classic Maya collapse involved a combination of environmental degradation, climate change, political fragmentation, and social inequality that has obvious parallels to conditions in the modern world. It is genuinely useful to remember that complex societies can and do fail, that success is not permanent, that the accumulated achievements of centuries can dissolve within a few generations if the conditions that sustain them cease to hold. These are lessons worth taking seriously. But there is also a way of drawing lessons from ancient collapse that is less useful, and I want to distinguish it from what I am suggesting. The apocalyptic reading of the Maya collapse, in which the Maya become a warning of what awaits our own civilization if we do not change our ways, tends to erase the actual complexity of what happened. It tends to treat the collapse as a single catastrophic event rather than the extended, uneven, geographically differentiated process that it actually was. It tends to erase the post-classic Maya and the colonial Maya and the modern Maya, treating them as though they were not really there, as though the civilization ended with the last inscription at Sebel in 889. This kind of reading serves the psychological needs of modern audiences looking for morality tales, but it does violence to the historical reality, and more importantly, to the living Maya people whose existence it implicitly denies. The better lesson to draw, I think, is more subtle and more hopeful. It is the recognition that catastrophe, even catastrophe of the magnitude that struck the southern Maya lowlands in the 9th and 10th centuries, does not necessarily mean the end of civilization. Cultures can survive their own institutional collapses if they preserve the deeper structures of meaning, the stories and the knowledge, and the ways of understanding the world that make them what they are. The specific forms may fail, but the underlying identity can continue if it is carried forward by people who remember who they are. This is a challenging lesson, because it requires us to think about civilization differently than we often do. It requires us to see civilization as something that lives primarily in the minds and practices of people rather than in the monuments and institutions those people build. It requires us to accept that our particular institutional arrangements are not necessarily permanent, and that if they fail, the meaningful question will not be whether they can be preserved, but whether we can carry forward the things that mattered most about them into whatever comes next. This is not an easy way of thinking, but it is, I believe, closer to how civilizations actually work than the more static picture we sometimes have. Return to the jungle now. Return to Tikal, to Palenque, to Copan. Walk through those ruins in your mind. See the pyramids emerging from the green sea of the forest, their carved surfaces weathered by centuries of tropical rain, their plazas hosting only the ghosts of the ceremonies that once filled them. Understand that these places, sacred as they were and are, do not represent the end of the Maya story. They represent a chapter in it. The chapter closed 1,000 years ago, and the story continued. Consider what the ancient Maya themselves might make of how we see them today, because we do see them in ways that would have astonished the last inhabitants of the great cities. Their monuments have been photographed and mapped and analyzed by generations of scholars. Their writing has been deciphered, and their inscriptions can be read again. Their achievements in art and architecture and astronomy and mathematics are recognized around the world as among the greatest of any ancient civilization. Millions of tourists travel each year to walk in the plazas where their kings once performed the rituals of divine kingship. The names of Pakal and Yaks Passage and Jasor Chankay Awil are known to schoolchildren in countries their bearers never dreamed of. There is a sense in which the abandonment of the cities, precisely because it left them to be reclaimed by the jungle rather than continuously inhabited and modified across the intervening centuries, has been the reason the ancient Maya are so richly present to us today. Had the cities continued to be lived in, they would have been transformed and rebuilt in ways that would have obscured the ancient forms. Had they been continuously visible and known, they would likely have been quarried for their stone and their carved monuments repurposed for other uses. It was the very fact of their abandonment, of being swallowed by the forest and hidden from view for centuries, that preserved them for eventual rediscovery. In this strange way, the tragedy of abandonment produced the possibility of preservation. The Maya kings sought immortality in stone, and although their political systems failed them and their dynasties were extinguished, the stone itself survived, waiting under the trees for centuries until it could be seen again and its inscriptions read. Consider Pakal, the great king of Palenque, in his tomb beneath the temple of the inscriptions. His scribes filled his sarcophagus lid, and the walls of his burial chamber with elaborate carvings meant to guarantee his passage into the divine realm and to secure his memory for eternity. When the tomb was sealed in 683, its final occupants must have believed that Pakal's memory would be sustained by the continuous ritual attention of his successors, the ceremonies performed atop the pyramid, and the regular tending of his sacred remains. But the successors failed. Within a century and a half of Pakal's death, Palenque was in decline. Within 2 centuries, it was silent. The rituals that were supposed to maintain his memory ceased. And yet, in 1952, when the Mexican archaeologist Alberto Ruz Lulia finally cleared the debris from the hidden staircase that led down into the pyramid and opened the tomb chamber, Pakal was waiting. His jade death mask covered his face. His body lay in the sarcophagus his workers had built for him, undisturbed for 12.5 centuries. The inscriptions that his scribes had carved were still there, still legible, waiting to be read. In that moment, Pakal's search for immortality achieved a kind of vindication he could not have imagined, not through the continuous rituals of his descendants, but through the accident of his tomb's forgetting and its rediscovery. He was remembered again. His name was read again. His face, or the mask that had covered his face, was seen again by human eyes. There is something in this that speaks to the deeper truth of the Maya story. The specific things the ancient Maya believed would preserve their memory failed. The dynasties failed. The rituals stopped. The cities emptied. And yet the deeper things they had made, the stone monuments and the carved inscriptions and the extraordinary intellectual achievements, survived through those very failures and became available to a future that neither they nor their contemporaries could have foreseen. The abandonment that seemed to be the end of their story turned out to be another chapter in a story that continues to unfold, in ways they could not have predicted, but that would, perhaps, have satisfied their sense of how time and memory really work. Because they knew, those ancient Maya scribes and astronomers and priests, that cycles turn and return. They knew that what falls silent may speak again. They knew that time is not a straight line, but a great wheel, and that even things that seem lost may, in the fullness of the turning, be recovered. Tonight we have traveled a long way together. We have walked through the jungles of the Petane and stood beneath the great pyramids of Tikal. We have descended into the tomb of Pakal at Palenque and read the inscriptions of Copan. We have watched the shadow of Kukulkan descend the staircase at Chichen Itza on the equinox. We have followed the long, slow catastrophe of drought and warfare and social breakdown that emptied the great southern cities. We have witnessed the migrations north and the flowering of new centers in the Yucatan. We have seen the Spanish burn the books at Mani and watched, centuries later, as scholars painstakingly reassembled the meanings that had been nearly lost. We have visited the daykeepers of highland Guatemala who still count the days of the Tzolk'in as their ancestors did before the pyramids of Tikal were even begun. And now, as our journey comes toward its end, it is time to return to the question that opened it. Why did the Maya abandon their cities? The answer, as we have discovered, is not one answer but many, and the many answers do not neatly resolve into a single tidy explanation. There was drought, more severe and more prolonged than the Maya agricultural systems had been designed to withstand. There was deforestation, driven by centuries of population growth and monumental construction, which amplified the effects of drought and destabilized local climates. There was population growth beyond what even a fully productive landscape could sustainably support. There was warfare between city-states that intensified as environmental stress bit deeper, consuming resources and populations that could no longer be replaced. There was political failure, as kings whose legitimacy depended on their ability to guarantee cosmic order proved unable to guarantee even the most basic requirements of daily life. There was social breakdown, as the burdens imposed by the elite class became intolerable to the farming populations whose labor sustained everything. There was, perhaps above all, a great collective judgment distributed across countless individual decisions that the old ways were no longer worth their cost. All of these factors were real. All of them contributed, and their interactions produced consequences greater than any of them could have produced alone. The collapse of the southern Maya cities was, in this sense, a case study in how complex systems fail, not from any single cause, but from the combination of many stresses that individually might have been manageable, but that collectively overwhelmed the system's capacity for adaptation. Modern systems theorists have language for this. They speak of cascading failures, of tipping points, of the way complex systems can appear stable for long periods and then transition suddenly to entirely different states when accumulated stresses exceed certain thresholds. The southern Maya lowlands in the 9th and 10th centuries provide one of the most detailed historical examples of exactly this kind of systemic transition that we possess. But if this is the mechanism of collapse, it is not the meaning of it. And the meaning is what we have really been searching for tonight. Because the question of what the collapse means to us, more than 1,000 years later, in a world where the very ruins of the abandoned cities have become powerful symbols in our own thinking about civilization and its fragility, is a question that cannot be answered by mechanisms alone. It requires us to think about what kind of story we are telling when we tell the story of the Maya, and what that story is for. There is a version of the story that treats the collapse as tragedy, pure and simple. A great civilization rose and shone and was extinguished, and what remains is only ruins and lessons. This version is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete. It misses the extraordinary continuity that we have documented, the persistence of Maya identity through catastrophes that would have annihilated less resilient peoples. It misses the recognition that the abandonment was not simply something that happened to the Maya, but something they, in significant part, chose to do, as a way of saving themselves from a system that had become unsustainable. It misses the millions of Maya alive today, whose existence contradicts the framing of the story as a story of ending. There is another version that treats the collapse as warning. A civilization that grew too complex, exploited its environment beyond sustainability, and paid the price. This version, too, is not wrong. It is useful. There are genuine parallels between the pressures that overwhelmed the classic Maya and the pressures our own civilization is generating for itself. Climate change, environmental degradation, political dysfunction, growing inequality, the fragility of complex interconnected systems. These are our problems, as they were the Maya problems. We would be foolish to ignore what their example can teach us. But this version, when it becomes the only version, tends to reduce the Maya to instruments of our own didactic purposes. It uses their history as a mirror for our fears rather than encountering their history in its own terms. The version I have tried to offer tonight is neither pure tragedy nor pure warning. It is, I hope, something more like an encounter with the full complexity of what happened and with the full humanity of the people to whom it happened. The Maya were not victims of forces beyond their comprehension. They understood, at least partially, what was happening to them. They made choices. Some of those choices, particularly the choices of the elite class in the final decades before collapse, seem to us in retrospect to have been catastrophically misguided. the doubling down on ceremonial extravagance while the reservoirs failed and the harvests withered. Other choices, particularly the choices of ordinary people to walk away from cities that could no longer be sustained, seem to us to have been acts of quiet wisdom. And the fact that the civilization survived, that its languages and calendars and stories and identity carried forward through the collapse and through the subsequent centuries of transformation and colonization and modern challenges, tells us that the story is not over. The Maya are still writing their story. New chapters are being composed even as we speak, in the villages of Highland Guatemala and the towns of Yucatan, and in the cities of Mexico and the United States, where Maya diaspora communities are building new lives. The children of families that fled the violence of the Guatemalan Civil War of the 1980s are now young adults, some of them going back to their ancestral communities to reclaim traditions their parents feared were being lost, some of them building new forms of Maya identity in contexts their ancestors could not have imagined. The story continues. If there is one deep lesson I would want to draw from the Maya story, it is not the obvious one about the fragility of civilizations, though that lesson is real. It is a different and perhaps more surprising lesson, and it is about the resilience of cultures. Institutions can fail. Political systems can collapse. Cities can be abandoned. Economic structures can dissolve. All of these things can happen and have happened repeatedly across human history. But cultures, understood as the deep patterns of meaning by which people make sense of their lives, can survive even catastrophic institutional collapse if they are held by people who continue to know themselves and to transmit that knowledge to the next generation. This is not a passive process. It requires work. It requires the deliberate choice, made in each generation, to remember, to transmit, to keep alive what came before while adapting it to what is. The Maya elders who taught their children the Tzolk'in days after the classic collapse were making that choice. The Maya scribes who wrote down the Popol Vuh in the Roman alphabet after the Spanish conquest were making that choice. The Maya activists today who are recovering and revitalizing languages that were suppressed for centuries are making that choice. It is a choice available to any people willing to make it. And the payoff, as the Maya example demonstrates, is the possibility of surviving as a people through changes of circumstance that would seem to be civilizational death. There is one final thought I want to leave you with as our journey ends. It concerns the relationship between the visible and the invisible in what a civilization is. When we visit the ancient sites, we see the visible. We see the pyramids and the plazas and the carved monuments. We see the physical scale and elaboration of what was built. It is easy to conclude, standing before those structures, that this is what the civilization was, that the buildings are the substance of it, that when the buildings were abandoned, the civilization ended. This is a natural but ultimately mistaken way of thinking, because the buildings, magnificent as they are, were only the visible manifestation of something invisible that had produced them. The invisible thing was the culture, the knowledge, the identity, the ways of being together in the world that had motivated the building and sustained it and given it meaning. The visible manifestations can be lost, and often are, without necessarily destroying the invisible source. That source, if it is protected and transmitted, can produce new manifestations under new circumstances. This is what the post-classic Maya did when the classic system failed them. This is what generations of Maya have continued to do through every subsequent challenge. We tend to overvalue the visible in our own time, too. We tend to identify our civilization with its most impressive artifacts, its cities and infrastructures and technologies and institutions. But if we take the Maya lessons seriously, we should understand that these are not really what our civilization is. Our civilization is the invisible thing that produces them, the accumulated knowledge and values and stories and ways of understanding the world that shape how we live and act together. If we want that civilization to survive, we need to be attentive to that invisible substance, to protect it, to transmit it, to make sure the coming generations know who they are and where they come from and what really matters. The visible things can be rebuilt if the invisible things survive. But if we let the invisible things atrophy while we focus only on the visible, we may find, as the classic Maya kings found, that all the monuments in the world cannot save us when the deeper foundations have failed. The forest still stands over the ruins of Tikal. The temples still rise from the jungle at Palenque, though most of the city is still hidden under the trees. The stelae at Copan still speak their inscriptions to those who have learned to read them. And in the highlands of Guatemala, in the towns of Yucatan, in the villages of Chiapas, the Maya are still there, still keeping the calendar, still telling the stories, still remembering themselves. The abandonment of the cities was not the end of the story. It was a chapter, and the story continues. Thank you for spending these hours with me tonight. May the memory of the ancient Maya inspire in us both the humility to learn from what they suffered and the hope to see, in their extraordinary endurance, that human civilization is more resilient than it sometimes seems, and that even from great losses, meaningful continuation is possible. Sleep well. The rivers still flow. The rains still come. And somewhere in the highlands tonight, a daykeeper is counting the days.